Thank you for this very flattering presentation, and above all, thank you for inviting me to give the Georg Forster lecture here in Mainz. This lecture is about work in progress. It exploits some of the consequences of the things I've been working on for the past 10, 15 years. In particular, it explores some of the consequences of the book you mentioned, Jenseits, Natur und Kultur, and in a specific domain, which is that of cosmopolitics, that is, the politics of dealing simultaneously with humans and non-humans. This concept of cosmopolitics has become, of late, fashionable again. Not, of course, in the classical sense of Kant, as qualifying the conditions for a project of world peace, implying a universality of the rules under which humans, wherever their location on Earth, could lead a civilized life. Not even in the sense rendered popular later on by Ulrich Beck, where cosmopolitism becomes the consciousness of a shared destiny uniting peoples everywhere in their exposure, so to say, to the same risks. Although cosmopolitism in the Beckian sense rightly implies the necessity for the sociologist to lead their studies beyond the confine of the nation state, it is nevertheless a notion built on a, so to speak, impoverished and normative world, very much like the Kantian cosmos, identical everywhere and for everyone. In the new cosmopolitism, or in the new cosmopolitics, by contrast, the ones, for instance, advocated by Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stengers, the cosmos is neither the universal one of Kant and Beck, nor any particular cosmos as a particular tradition may conceive it. It is rather a project referring to the possibility of setting on an equal footing a multiplicity of worlds, a project which would then steer the politics of scientific knowledge in particular in an entirely new direction from the one it has followed until now. But I use cosmopolitics yet in another sense, perhaps more down to earth and certainly more faithful to the etymology as the kind of operators that relate worlds and manage to bring together and to articulate things and beings who would seem otherwise to exist in different ontological planes. Now, and I speak out of my anthropological experience, these operators differ widely according to the principles that organize the variety of assemblages of humans and non-humans, of which the ethnographic and historical records offer us rich and kaleidoscopic testimony. So the view from afar, which is the second part of the title, is thus simply the perspective that anthropologists are able to take when they try to make sense of the bewildering diversity of ontological regimes under which all classes of beings are associated. And cosmopolitics are the forms that these associations take, each of them constituting a sort of world of its own, so that they become viable, at least for a while. Before developing this idea, however, I would like to say a few introductory words on the nature of and on the motives for the general project of reformulation of anthropological concepts that I have pursued for the past 20 years, let's say. One of the main motivations for this theoretical enterprise is to deepen the labor of critique and of relativization of the methodological and analytical tools that are used in the social sciences in order to propound other tools which could be more faithful to the very diverse realities that these tools are supposed to apprehend, to qualify, and to organize in a comparative framework. So the basic notions of these disciplines, such as culture, nature, society, history, economy, politics, religion, art, etc., have allowed to enlighten our condition, our collective condition of Europeans, and to put words on realities which were in the process of gaining a perceptible autonomy between the beginning of the 18th and the end of the 19th century. A period, a crucial period, during which were forged the main concepts which have allowed Europe to define itself reflexively as a collective anchored, rooted in a historical process. So these concepts are everything but trans-historical. They are, on the contrary, the product of a social and cultural history which is entirely singular. So they are linked intrinsically to the socio-political destiny of modern Europe. And in spite of that, they were used or reused afterwards by the social sciences, and in particular by anthropology, to describe and to explain non-European societies as if the validity of these concepts was universal. Now this quiet conviction that our societies, our European societies, could serve as templates to qualify any form of association is truly linked to the evolutionary or evolutionist ideology, which was dominant during the period when these concepts were forged, and which saw, in fact, in all human groupings, the possibility or destiny to follow the same stages, to become perhaps one day, and with the help of colonization, of course, societies analogous to those that were found in Europe, with the same kind of institution, with the same kind of division between domains, economic, political, ideological, etc. Meanwhile, these so-called exotic societies were but imperfect prefiguration of societies in which ethnologists were attempting to discern the still blurred form of their future realization as complete societies similar to ours. So we have here a constitutive paradox of anthropology. of modern anthropology, that is from the beginning of the 20th century. The Eurocentrism of the concepts that anthropology uses, sometimes militantly claimed as such by some anthropologists, as a sort of token of scientificity for their discipline. This Eurocentrism, it seems to me, on the contrary, signals a fading away of the relativist principle which had been deployed by ethnology from at least at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, when I'm speaking here of the principle of relativism, I'm speaking of methodological relativism and not as moral relativism. This relativism that the first generation of ethnologists had developed in their field inquiries consists very simply in not taking the values in the institutions of the observer as templates to calibrate the values and the institutions of what they observe. And ethnology followed this principle very efficiently in many domains. For instance, when ethnology described and analyzed systems of kinship and marriage, alliance, forms of organization of the family, types of exchange of goods, theories of the person, modes of categorization of plants and animals, etc. In all these cases, European institutions were not taken as anthropological universals. Whether, for instance, the European heterosexual monogamous family, or the capitalist market, or the Cartesian conception of the division between the body as res extensa and the mind as res cogitans, or the Linnean classification of natural objects. Now, this principle of methodological relativism, which is completely ingrained in the practice of ethnology, and which has been very well and wisely used in domains like kinship, circulation of goods, the study of ontogenesis, or the biological knowledge, has not been followed, was not pursued until its last consequence. That is to say, until calling into question the general framework within which these values and institutions are developed, and this, of the observer, of course, and this general framework, well, it's the ontology with which we are familiar and which I've called naturalism. An ontology, the furniture of which is composed of beings which are not surprising for us, of course: society, nature, progress, cultural habits, neat separation between the social and the economical, between things and persons, between scientific knowledge and religious belief, but beings which exist under this form in no other ontology. So, by taking stock of the historically contingent character of this naturalist ontology, I do not advocate a sort of hyper-relativism. To the contrary, my ambition is to elaborate analytical tools which would be as best as possible unaffected by the historical characteristics which the concepts of the social sciences actually possess. So concepts like, or phenomena like gravitational force, or the formula, chemical formula for water, or photosynthesis, all these qualify objects and phenomena, the principles of composition and of functioning of which are identical everywhere on our planet. But it's not the case at all with notions like nature, society, culture, which in fact cut up the texture of the world according to organizing schemes or patterns which are proper only to one part of the world and to a specific period of time. In short, analytical tools that are perfectly relative, although they unduly claim to be universals. This is why it appeared to me necessary to push the reflection further by not contenting myself with the critique of such a notion of the sociological repertoire, and by going back to a deeper level of the making up of the common world, to wit, the level of the detection of regularities in the world, regularities which, when they are systematized, render possible forms of collectives, regularities in the conception of the subject, which are proper to large social universe. By proceeding in this way, I do not consider anymore, as it is still common in the social sciences, societies as already constituted entities, that is to say, as assemblages of humans who follow the conventions that they have chosen for themselves. But I try rather to understand how specific collectives come about, of which some of them see themselves, only some of them, see themselves as societies. This is what I mean by the ontological turn under which this kind of enterprise has been classified. It's not a thesis or a statement on what the world is about, but it is an inquiry on the way humans detect such or such characteristics of the objects surrounding them to make worlds out of them. And it is because the primary modalities of the identification of the world vary that the forms of collective that humans will imagine or elaborate will also differ. Humans will be immersed in configurations, political configurations, in types of exchange, in kinds of relations between themselves and with non-humans, which vary in a large measure and which transform through time. So my ambition is to bring to a more elementary level the critical ambition of the social sciences to make them more capable of grasping the general form of interactions between beings. And from this point of view, of course, it's not anymore social sciences as usually defined. That is, sciences that concern themselves exclusively with integrated sets of humans, since within these very diverse assemblages, the interactions that are to be studied and understood happen between agents with very different ontological forms of status. Humans, of course, but also all kinds of organisms, artifacts, representations, affordances, physical effects, deities, images, and many more items. So the science that is to be built and which would hopefully replace social sciences in the traditional sense might be more akin to a general science of relations. An ecology in the largest sense, at least in the sense that Gregory Bateson had prefigured, a science which is yet to come, of course, and to which would contribute all the disciplines that are interested in what one might call interagentivity, that is the process that brings about emerging properties out of the interaction between human and non-human agents which possess different qualities, but qualities that are liable to affect one another mutually. So it's obvious that if I have placed this enterprise under the sign of ontology, it is in no way to claim an annexion by anthropology of a domain which was formerly reserved to philosophy. It is, above all, to insist on the fact that the level where I think that the anthropological analysis has to locate itself is more elementary than the one where it operated until now. One cannot explain the system of differences in the properly human manner to inhabit the world by considering these differences as the derived product of such and such a type of institution, of such a type of economic organization, of technical infrastructure, of such a regime of values, of world vision, etc., etc. All these aspects of the collectives that have been hypostasized in separate domains by the social sciences with the ambition to bringing out different forms of determination. On the contrary, all these aspects are the stabilized, at least for me, the stabilized results of more fundamental intuitions as to what the world contains and as to the kind of relations that the human and non-human components of the world entertain. So the word ontology appeared to me appropriate to designate this analytical level, which one could call also anti-predicative in the language of phenomenology, for instance. And this is why I've started to use this word ontology, although very parsimoniously, some 20 years back. So if I have contributed to what is now known under the ontological term, and that's an expression I've never used myself, except perhaps as a comment tonight, it is, for me, out of requirement of conceptual hygiene. That is, one has to look for the roots of human diversity at a deeper level, yes, which is the level of the differences between the basic inferences that humans produce as a result of the situation they are in, apropos all sorts of beings that people the world, and about the ways that these beings maintain relations. From there, there ensue the types of collectives within which common life unfolds, and the nature of the composition of these collectives. From there ensue the form of subjectivation and objectivation. From there ensue the regimes of temporality, the forms of figuration. From there ensue, in fact, all the richness of social and cultural life. So now let's get back to a crucial question. How are we to approach the cosmopolitics in all their diversity without falling into an Eurocentric bias? Well, first by admitting that the main difference between non-modern cosmopolitics and the modern political institutions, this main difference stems from the fact that non-modern cosmopolitics are able to integrate non-humans in collectives, or to see non-humans as political subjects acting in their own collectives, while modern political institutions confine, usually, non-humans to a function of surrounding, let's say, of resource, or of support of symbolic activity. In other words, the kind of common beings which result from modern political institutions are not those that are commonly found elsewhere, because we are used to live in worlds or in collectives that are exclusively composed of human persons. Elsewhere, we find collectives where there are associations of humans and non-humans that can take very different forms. For instance, if one looks in detail to what are the components of what the anthropologists call a descent group, whatever, a clan, a lineage, a SIB, any other unit of the same kind. No, not as anthropology defines it usually, that is, as a group of humans that are descended from a common ancestor, but as a specific group of persons conceive, well, such units, of course, exist, conceive of it, then one cannot fail to see or to realize that this kind of unit contain much more than humans. I'll take two brief examples. Among the Dabe Peul in Niger, there's a word, dudal, which usually designates under in the writings of anthropologists a fraction of lineage. That is, the biggest segmentary unit functioning as a corporate group. However, and as the Italian anthropologist Angelo Bonfiglioli has shown in this case, dudal designates both a line of humans and a line of zebus. That is, the zebus is not a common word, it's a form of cow that is common in the area. A line of zebus that a line of humans have selected through generations. So that, as Bonfiglioli writes, I quote him, the herd of Zebus is a language through which social order can be expressed. I think it goes much beyond an expression of social order, because here we have a group of humans and of a group of domestic animals. We have the doodle as a lineage and the doodle as a group of animals. And these form a continuous and imbricated totality, which is designated by a sole term. Other example, perhaps which is more striking, in the Andes, there is a social, what has been described for a long time as a social unit, very well known, it's called IU. And in the ethnographic literature, IU is traditionally defined as, there are various definitions, but usually it's either a kinship group, might be a lineage, a sort of lineage, or a native community possessing a territorial basis and engaging in common actions, in particular in ritual action. Now, when one looks in detail at the ethnography of Andean communities, it is obvious that the IU is much more than a human grouping. It includes also plants, animals, spirits, and many, many other things. Let's listen to what an informant of the Peruvian and American anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena writes. His name is Justo Osha. He lives in the region of Cusco. And I quote him, an IU is like a cloth or a fabric, and all the things in the world, people, humans, mountains, plants, are like the threads which form the motifs. The beings of this world are not alone. In the same way that a lone thread is not a cloth, a human, and he uses the Quechua word runa, is always in IU with other beings. That is IU, end of quote. In other words, in the clan, in the lineage, in the totemic group, or in the IU, there is always much more than humans, men, women, children, dead or alive. There are also animals, there are plants, there are territories, there are deities, there are spirits, there are sanctuaries, there are pathogens, there are items of knowledge, forms of expertise, and many, many more things that are absolutely necessary for life. And these components are present ab initio. They are constitutive of the mixed unit that these kinds of segments form. They are not added afterwards as a sort of suggestive decor for the theater of human actions, or as simple providers of metaphors to better express the sociality of human actions as the social sciences have tended to treat them. So the idea according to which the unit of analysis of anthropology is provided by the humans only appears to me as a blockage which has obfuscated the analysis of the properly political dimensions of collective life elsewhere than in modern societies. There were good reasons for that. There were good reasons. The anthropocentrism of modernity plunges its roots, its philosophical roots, in the struggle against the organic order of the Ancien Régime. And it goes hand to hand with the development of social individualism, which is the basis of all modern legitimacy, which had, as a result, the promotion of institutions and of regimes of existence which were in frank discontinuity with the pre-revolutionary assemblages. What happened, in fact, from the point of view of the recompositions of the relations between humans and non-humans between the end of the 16th century and the 19th century, first in England, in the United Kingdom in general, and then in the rest of Europe, and then in the United States? Well, the hierarchized segments of collectives based on statutory order decomposed to liberate a huge crowd of human individuals which were equal in right, but not necessarily in fact, and of course that effective discontinuities continued to separate as much within the particular communities where they were distributed as within the formal aggregate that all these communities constituted altogether in the so-called concert of nations. So the mixed cosmos that each collective had cut out to its own measure became diluted in an infinite universe, which was progressively recognized as such by all those, independently of their position on the surface of the earth, who admitted the universality of the non-human laws that ruled this universe. The city of God fragmented itself in a multiplicity of societies from which non-humans were banished, again, in de jure and not necessarily de facto, thus giving birth to collectives which had the same structure, the same composition, and which were then comparable, and then which could be used as a fodder for the social sciences, although, of course, even if they were comparable, they were still, for at least for a long time, and still in a large measure today, considered unequal between them in an evolutionary, covert or advocated evolutionary scale, in part because of the apparent incapacity of some of these collectives, of these non-modern collectives. This incapacity they showed of evicting, in fact, from the heart of social life, the non-humans that were accommodated there. In other words, the invention of modern collectives was made possible by a radical purge. Non-humans were expelled from the city, and only humans were allowed to stay there as, again, subjects or de jure subjects. So the representation that the moderns have given to their own form of aggregation, political aggregation, was then transposed to the analysis of non-modern societies, at the same time has a great number of specificities, such as the division between nature and culture, between belief and knowledge, between fact and value, or more simply, the idea that a clan, lineage, or an IU only contain humans. It is with this conception, which is both Eurocentric and anthropocentric, this conception of the political, that I wish to break up with. To do this, and in particular when one is interested in the relations of humans with the places they inhabit, one needs to divest oneself from a number of prejudices. That is, one needs to become conscious of that the concept that we use ordinarily to describe collectives, non-modern collectives, qualify situations that are essentially characteristic of modern societies, or modern collectives, if you wish. I will only give two brief examples. The first refer to the idea of appropriation in general, and more particularly to the idea of appropriation of a territory. It is a notion which has been very useful to anthropologists, to historians, to geographers, to define independently of historical situation and local usages, the relations of a collective to the place it inhabits, while it is typically the product of a juridical system and a philosophical system which is proper to the West. Ever since the beginning of the enclosures, the movement of the enclosures in England first, and then in Europe, and then in other parts of the world, there's been a steady movement to transform into alienable goods and privately appropriated and a growing part of the living environments. And this movement of mercantilization, which has, of course, nothing, is in no way universal, was in part rendered possible by a conception of appropriation as the act through which an individual or a community becomes the titular of a right on a component of the world. A conception which is extremely or completely radically linked to the modern political philosophy, such as it was developed in the 17th and the 18th century, especially in the United Kingdom, and in particular the theory of possessive individualism. Now, this configuration has little meaning for what pertains to the relation to land in many, I would say all, non-modern collectives, if only because of the fact that in many of these collectives, in particular in a great number of non-European kingships, the power of the sovereign concerns the control of humans or of cosmic fecundity, and not directly the land. He has no access to the land. But it is also the very notion of territory which one has to interrogate, for in a non-modern context, a territory rarely corresponds to what we have commonly conceived under this term since the emergence of the Westphalian system, that is, a portion of space upon which a state exerts its sovereignty and the stable limits of which are recognized by neighboring states. It is, in fact, very common that the same physical space, as all anthropologists here know, can be used as a territory by different human groups in the same way that a collective may use different spaces constituting a discontinuous territory. Furthermore, the use of a territory is never dependent upon only humans. It is also dependent upon a great number of non-humans who appear to manifest an autonomous agency. Deities, spirits, ancestors, ghosts, plants, animals, whatever, you name it, with whom humans must compose or from whom they depend. However, before following the discussion of this notion of territory, I would like to come back on another concept which I've used several times in this lecture, a concept which plays a central role in the labor of refoundation, which to me seems yet to be accomplished, to foster a new cosmopolitics which would be purged from the Eurocentrism and the anthropocentrism that we have inherited from political philosophy. And this concept is the concept of collective. Contrarily to other categories that designate organized sets of beings, the concept of collective has the huge merit of not prejudging in no way the content of what is associated, neither the content nor the modes of assemblage. With the collective, then, the dissociation, the ontological dissociation between associations of humans, society, nation, ethnic group, community, lineage, class, whatever, social, professional category, you name it, on the one hand, and non-human groupings, species, herd, technical branch, pantheon, collection, whatever the name you use, this ontological dissociation is not relevant anymore. It does not mean that all the forms of association are identical, of course. It is our job as anthropologists precisely to define the various forms of association. But their typology, the typology of these associations of collectives that appear as collectives, does not rest anymore on the principal distinction between humans and non-humans, which is the basis of the regime of modernity. So how are we to define a collective then? I've borrowed the notion initially from Bruno Latour, but the use I make of it is a bit different from his. For Latour, as you may know, the collective is the product of a literal action of collecting, by the means of which diverse types of force and beings are associated. It is thus a process and even a project which is indissociable of the actor network theory, of which it constitutes one of the main tools, and which consists in assembling heterogeneous entities that have not yet been assembled to put to test the relevance of their association. So it's an experimental enterprise which aims at connecting associations of humans and of non-humans that are not divided anymore a priori by the great divide between the domain of nature and the domain of society. So the Latourian collective designates a sort of dynamic which is at the same time epistemic, metaphysical, and politic, a dynamic of composition, of progressive composition of a common world which ignores the two attractors, the common attractors of modernity, nature and society. It follows that no specification, no initial specification is required as to the beings which integrate the collective and as to the relations that unite these beings. So, in short, the collective, for Latour, is what justifies the labor of investigation because its nature and its composition are never known in advance. So in that sense, the Latourian collective is not an object, is not a substantive object, or it's not even a principle of composition. It's a process that aims to reproduce in an analysis the very movement of recruitment of sets of humans and non-humans that the analyst adopted as his object of study, and that the citizen also adopted as a matter for experimenting, a set which, if everything goes well, might become a new form of political existence, and that is to say, could enlarge itself to other human and non-human actants. One has to recognize the great interest of a notion, such as this one, as defined in the Latourian context, which accounts for real assemblages of beings without operating a discrimination within these sets. However, it seems to me that reducing the collective to the process, to the only process of collecting undertaken by the moderns in order to overcome their divided condition, amounts to depriving oneself of everything that the non-moderns can teach us in the matter. For we are used to consider that humans and non-humans are associated in totalities governed by unitary principles, we as anthropologists, or that assemblages, monospecific assemblages of humans interact with monospecific assemblages of non-humans by obeying to identical rules of sociability, which is the case, the most common case that I personally observed in Amazonia, which I labeled animism, or that mixed groups of humans and non-humans cooperate in all aspects of social life at the same time as they remain ontologically different one from the other. All these genres of collectives are common forms under which non-moderns present themselves to us in all the imaginative diversity of their institutions. This is why one has to acknowledge that collectives do not acquire only their consistency as the product of a collecting operated by an analyst, but also that they exist perhaps essentially under stabilized forms, under canonical forms that the social and political anthropology, as admittedly described in a fragmentary fashion and with an anthropocentric bias, although it is not impossible to restore them in all the richness and the complexity of their architecture. Furthermore, these stabilized forms of collectives have not been invented by some clever anthropologist to provide analytical templates to his colleagues. Their principles of composition are entirely explicit for the humans that are members of these collectives and who know very well how to evaluate their merits in contrast with the principles of compositions that are common in the neighboring collectives. So it would be absurd and condescending to reserve the comparative anthropology of collectives only to the scholars who would have been able to extirpate themselves from the front of modernization. In other words, a collective, in the sense I give to this term, is a stabilized form of association between beings who can be ontologically homogeneous or heterogeneous, according to the type of collective, and the principles of compositions and the modes of relations of which are specifiable and susceptible to be dealt with reflexively by the human members of these assemblages, notably when it is a question of qualifying relations with neighboring collectives where these principles and these modes are not found. From this, it follows that the collective, in the sense I give it to it, does not take the appearance of a Latourian network. Indeed, if a collective is, for me, also a set where entities of all kinds are combined, it is not, properly speaking, organized as a network, the limits of which are impossible to define in principle if one decides to follow all the ramifications of the network, the limits of which can only depend upon an arbitrary decision of the analyst to circumscribe his field of study to the data that he can muster. A collective is neither homologous to the classical sociological categories designating associations, and to which one would have added a few non-humans for the sake of completeness, so to say. So a society plus its nature, an ethnic group plus its ancestors, civilizations plus its deities, a social professional category plus its tools and the material that it uses, etc., etc. One can hardly see in that case what benefit in terms of intelligibility could be obtained, since the non-humans would still be a sort of decoration which is added to a massively anthropocentric block. This is why I've made the hypothesis that the principles of composition of a collective, that is what defines the nature of the beings that a collective associates, and the possible links that these beings can entertain, are ultimately dependent upon what I've called modes of identification. I will very briefly recall what I mean by that. The general idea is that one should consider the apparent diversity of cultural habits as the product of differential process of worlding, that is, of manners to actualize the vast quantity of qualities, of phenomena, of beings, of relations that can be objectified by humans by the means of ontological filters which allow humans to discriminate between what the environment offers to their perceptions. I've called modes of identification these ontological filter which structure the worlding process by using an idea that was put forward by Mauss, Marcel Mauss, when he wrote, I quote him, "Man identifies two things and identify things to him by having at the same time the sense of the differences and the resemblances that he establishes." So one has to consider these modes of identifications as sort of cognitive schema and sensory motor schema also, which are incorporated and developed within in the process of the socialization in a physical and social, specific physical and social milieu, which function as devices of schematization of our practices, of our intuitions, of our perceptions, without mobilizing a discursive knowledge. In other words, it's the kind of mechanism which allows us to recognize certain things as meaningful and to ignore other, to carry on sequences of action without thinking about it, what is called in cognitive psychology script, or to interpret in a certain way some events or some statements, which allows us also to channel our inferences regarding the properties of the objects that are present in our environment. And in spite of the diversity of the qualities that I can detect in beings and in things, one can infer from clues that are offered by the appearance of this object of our perception and from clues offered by their behavior, some patterns, and these patterns, that is, the ways that the qualities that we perceive are organized, it seems to me, are limited. Our judgments of identity, that is, the recognition of similitudes and differences between objects and events, cannot depend upon analytical comparisons that are made piecemeal. For reasons of cognitive economy, these judgments of identity have to be produced quickly and in a non-conscious fashion by induction from schemes that are shared and which are as many devices that allow to structure the perceived qualities and to organize behavior. So, using a very simple thought experiment, I've made the hypothesis that there were only 4 modes of identification, that is, 4 manners of systematizing ontological inferences, each of these manners being based on the type of resemblances and differences that humans detect between themselves and non-humans on a double plane, which is both physical and moral, let's say. Indeed, in front of an indeterminate alter, and I like to use the Latin word aliud rather than alter, because aliud means that precisely it's an alter that has not yet been determined in a specific, by a specific relation. So it is really at an antipredicative level. In front of an indeterminate value then, human or non-human, I can surmise either that it possesses elements of physicality and interiority identical to mine, and I've called that totemism, or that its interiority and its physicality are entirely distinct from mine, and I've called that analogism, or that we have similar interiorities and heterogeneous physicalities, and I've called that animism, or that our interiorities are different and our physicalities are similar, and I've called that naturalism. I won't come back to this. I've devoted at least 2 books to this. What interests me now is to test the relevance of these schemes, of these models, if you wish, by checking up their analytical output to account for the structural variations in fields of practice and of representation that are very diverse. One of these fields of practice and representation, corresponding to what is traditionally labeled as social and political anthropology, is simply the variety of manners according to which the modes of identification condition the forms of association between humans and non-humans in specific groupings. So it appeared useful for me to consider how animism, totemism, naturalism, analogism become instituted in ontologies which will privilege such or such a mode as a principle of organization of the regime of existence, and how these ontologies, in turn, prefigure a kind of collective which is more adequate to the gathering in a common project or a common destiny of the types of being that it distinguishes, and to the complementary expression of their properties in practical life. So it is obviously an approach which is frankly ontological. By contrast with the Durkheimian approach, which is still more or less the most common, if only by preterition, in the social sciences, it is not the dominant categories of social lives which serve as templates here to understand the world, according to the famous formula, society or religion is society transfigured. It is, on the contrary, the organizing principles of cosmologies, the nature of the people that are present in these cosmologies, the relation that they are able to maintain between themselves, which will define the singular form that these assemblages of human and non-human will take. How are we to study that? And I'm almost finished. How do we study collectives according to the manner in which they are conceptualized and lived by those who compose them? Of course, by empirical inquiries, obviously. The sociological question is, in fact, basically a question of inventory, and according to an old expression also of social physics, physique sociale in French. What kind of being is associated with what other kind of being, or on the contrary, separated from it, in what way, by what type of association, for what motives, for what action that it will develop in common, etc., etc. And of course, the answer to these questions can only come from the human part of the collective. I'm not entirely naive. It would be illusory to think that volcanoes or lakes or the Pachamama or the herds of llamas will explain us how they conceive their common belonging to an ayllu, for instance, or so the anthropocentric bias is hardly avoidable as soon as one becomes interested beyond the ordinary interactions between humans and non-humans that can be studied in a more or less symmetrical manner, when one becomes interested in the guiding principles of a particular world and the ontological distribution of the beings which compose this world, all elements that can be only formulated in the symbolic language proper to humans. However, the semantic anthropocentrism of non-modern collectives is mitigated by the fact that it has, as a consequence, the giving to non-humans a dignity of agent and, in some cases, of subject, while our anthropocentrism, which is ontological and principle, is, by contrast, conceived as an a priori mechanism of exclusion and compartmentalization. However indispensable they may be, empirical studies are not by themselves enough to distinguish the guiding lines in the way that collectives are composed. So the hypothesis that I've propounded, I've already said that, is that the principles of composition of a collective depend ultimately on the modes of identification, and this is why I have started an inquiry, well, several inquiries. One was on images, of which I won't talk today. But the other one is an inquiry where I concern myself with the forms of collectives in which the different types of ontology can find an expression. And since I'm also conscious of the extreme diversity of these forms, when you take them from the point of view of the institutions which make them visible from the political institution, the system of political and social organization, systems of kinship, passing through all the ritual mediations that are necessary for the harmonious functioning of the cosmos, etc. I have opted to concern myself in the project which I've just started to the mechanisms that ensure the control of space or the manners in which space is inhabited and used. And of course, of the types of cohabitation that are found with non-humans to which these different types of space to which the kind of cohabitation they allow, in brief, to the relation to land taken in its more general term. It's a central question, of course. But one of the important aspects of this is that putting an emphasis on the way to inhabit space allows to avoid a too overtly anthropocentric approach, since more or less all the beings that are recognized that entering into the composition of a collective are also attached to localities that are more or less identified and circumscribed. Plants, animals, deities, rivers, volcanoes, spirits, dead totems are all localized in sites, in domains, in biomes, in geological formations, which stabilize the relations they maintain with other existence with whom they share a living environment. So by contrast with other dimensions of common life, in which the components of a collective may be more or less involved from the point of view of locality, humans and non-humans share the same characteristic. They are all situated. Only the mosaic God, this extraordinary invention of the Near East, is an exception to the rule because it's at the same time everywhere and nowhere. But is alone and is a transcendent to the collective, contrarily to the other principles of totalization, by the means of which communities of beings can be taken hold of from a unique vantage point, which remains internal to the totalized set. So this approach requires, and this is my conclusion, a redefinition of politics, which gives to the assemblages of humans and non-humans and to the conflicts which they harbor an expression which is not yet completely recognized to them beyond, let's say, the scholarly world. As the French philosopher Jacques Rancière has shown in one of his books, La Mésentente, the disagreement, modern politics has required to deploy itself much more than the divisions between humans that give rise to struggles, debates, confrontations, etc. Modern politics is in reality actually based on the partition of the sensible between humanity and nature, which characterize the modern era, or what, that is how Rancière defines it, or what I call myself naturalism. This partition was for a long time organized in a hierarchical fashion between those who had more humanity and less nature. Europeans, men, adults, literati, owners, etc. And those who had less humanity because they had more nature. Savages, children, women, mad people, workers, etc. With this clause that the former were entitled to political preeminence upon the latter. But this repartition also was not internal to the European world. It had as an effect that the worlds which did not conform themselves to this hierarchical division, because they were not organized around the division between nature and society, or between humanity and nature, these worlds did not exist and still do not exist on the political plane. Now, another conception of the politics is possible. It is one precisely that Rancière advocates when he writes, politics is not made of relations of power, it is made of relations of worlds. What he means by that is, on the one hand, that relations of power exist everywhere. So it is, one could hardly see how the expression of these relations would belong exclusively to the political sphere. But what he means also is that a political subject is not a group that becomes conscious of itself, or that acquires a voice, that acquires the possibility to impose its weight on society. It is an operator which joins and disjoins regions, identities, functions, capacities that exist in the configuration of a given experience. So in that sense, any operator, human or non-human, is capable of becoming a political subject if it manages to bring together things which have initially no intrinsic connections, notably because they apparently belong to entirely what look like entirely different ontological regimes. So in these times where the very idea of politics has become so bland as to restrict itself to designate mere techniques of management of humans, it seems to me that the example of the non-modern collectives that anthropologists study recall us that other forms of composition of worlds are possible, which we urgently need to pay heed to, so as to account for them, and also so as for us to create new cosmopolitics that the present moment requires, it seems to me, with urgency. Thank you.